I Am Legend, easily one of my favorite films of all time. So I thought I should read the source material. I should read the book. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson is very different than the film. I decided to read it and I'm going to go over the differences. I'm going to do something that isn't done very often, which is to say that the movie is way better than the book. First, the differences. One of the major differences is that I Am Legend, the book, is set in Los Angeles and the movie is set in New York. It's kind of cool that the book actually takes place in Los Angeles. Another huge difference is the movie is contemporary. Obviously, there's been some sort of plague in recent times, but the book takes place in the late 70s. I had no idea that the book is as old as it is because as I was reading it, my copy had a copyright date of 1995, which they show the most recent date of the book, but not necessarily when the book was originally written, for those of you who don't read books. So I thought, oh, it was published in 1995, it was written in 1995. And then there's a part of the book where he makes a reference to one of his coworkers as a Negro, and I was like, I literally was like, why did he use that word? Because I was thinking of it as being set in the 90s. So, clarification, it was written in 1954, which is crazy. More on that in a second. And it takes place in the late 70s. So, it was written in the 50s, but it's about the 70s. The film, however, is very contemporary. This one doesn't matter as much, but obviously the character is white. He's got like blonde, long hair and a beard, which I did think was interesting because Will Smith is so polished in the movie. But it makes more sense that the guy is kind of scraggly and doesn't take care of himself since, he's literally the last person on Earth, supposedly. No dog. There is a dog technically in the book. It is not a German Shepherd, and it's definitely not his companion how it is in the movie. In the book, it's like a random dog that maybe a chapter or two is spent on him kind of trying to lure the dog and make sure that the dog will be his friend. And then spoilers, because I'm going to spoil everything, because honestly the book's from the 50s, so if you haven't read it, sorry, I can't help you. And if you haven't seen the movie, it doesn't matter because it's totally different than the movie. But spoiler, once he finally gets the dog to get in his place and safe, and he feeds it and stuff and is trying to nurse it to health, it literally dies. And it's a side note in the book. It's and the dog was dead 2 weeks later. So I was like, wah, wah. The dog, I believe, and people can disagree with me, but I think the dog is such a huge character, and that scene where the dog defends him, gets injured by one of the vampires and starts to turn and he has to kill his friend. I can't. It honestly is what makes the movie, I believe, one of the best movies and why I can watch it numerous times. It's such a powerful, amazing scene. Another major difference is the vampires in the film are zombie-ish. They're definitely vampires, but there's a zombie vibe to them. They're like a contemporary zombie thing. In the book, the vampires are very literal. And the vampires can be killed in all the cliches. So a stake through the heart, garlic repels them, crosses repel them, or if they're Jewish, various religious paraphernalia will also repel them, which I did think was a cool for him to write that in the 1950s, that if somebody believed it in their life, when they become a vampire, they would believe it in their death. So if you're a Christian, I guess a cross would repel you, but the Torah could repel you if you were a Jew. So I think that's really cool as a side note. But the vampires are very literally vampires. And he, in the book, can go kill them during the day because they're basically just immobile, and so he discovers them in a bed or hiding in the dirt or whatever, and he can just kill them. In the film, the vampires are more in a catatonic state but can be woken, and there's a really great, awesome, scary scene when he goes into a dark building to follow the dog. Again, the dog's a huge plot point in the film, and they're there, but they wake up and can be deadly when they wake up. In the book, it's meh, they're just chilling, and he's totally safe during the day because they're sleeping or slumbering like a vampire would. The character in the book is really unlikable. He's clearly an alcoholic, which there's no reference to that in the film. He is clearly depressed, which, you know, who wouldn't be? He has a wife and a daughter, which actually that's not in the film either, who died from the virus prior to everything. So he's, you know, bitter and sad and all that, but he's just a miserable misanthrope, misery kind of guy. And I found myself often reading, like trying to get through the pages because I'm like, yeah, dude. Like, he just is miserable. He's constantly breaking glasses and drinking himself into a stupor. And I was very surprised because, again, the Will Smith character is very like smooth and slick and savvy and like, you know, has all these great things going for him and is trying to discover how he can cure, which let's talk about that for a second. That's the other thing I found surprising is him trying to cure the disease in the book. I had heard that was a huge plot point, but I have to say it really isn't. Like, it's mostly him bitching and kind of like flashing back, thinking about his past. But there is some reference. Remember, it's the 50s set in the 70s. So he gets a microscope and he goes to the library and he does stuff like that to kind of start to understand, you know, where this disease came from, this vampire disease. But it's really not like that much about him trying to cure it, which he doesn't, which also leads me to my biggest point, which is the ends are totally different. The book ends with him being basically abducted by this new race of vampires and put in a prison, and a vampire chick that he kind of like befriended, but he didn't know she was a vampire, who was in his house. She gives him suicide pills so that he can take them before they can kill him. And that's how it ends. In the movie, and the movie's a whole other thing because there's different endings, but the movie is a way more dynamic. And there's a sacrifice in the movie, in the film version of it, but in the book there isn't. He just becomes kind of a myth, and there is a resolution in him that he's going to be now the way that humans perceive vampires and distrusted them. The vampires are now going to remember humans that way because he's the last one. So there is an irony there. In conclusion, I didn't really like the book. The things that it had going for it is it's definitely ahead of its time. I think the idea of it being written in 1954 prior, because he wrote it before, that's pretty cool. Like, some of the subject matters, the idea of this disease, this pandemic spreading on the world, I think was pretty original. But the character is just like miserable all the time, and there's really no redemption in the book. He's also, in my opinion, like super sexist, just the way he kind of interacts with the female characters, the rare female characters that you see him with. And like I said, he's just a total misanthrope and really just doesn't dig anybody. The movie, in contrast, is so dynamic. I'm glad I read the book, but I gotta say, the book is nothing like the movie, and I don't recommend it. PSA also, if you get this book, because if you decide to read the I Am Legend book, be aware that even though it doesn't say anything, it's only half the book. The other half is short stories by Richard Matheson. So I was reading it and it ended very clearly where like he takes the pills, and then it goes on and there's these other random stories, and it took me like a couple of the stories to figure out that they were not connected. So just be aware that this book has short stories with it.